Think about the grand sweep of history for a moment. We often picture it as a story of kings and conquerors, of epic battles and dramatic revolutions. But what if I told you that some of the most powerful forces shaping our world were not thrones or armies, but something far more subtle? What if the true architects of empires were not the figures celebrated in textbooks, but a hidden class of individuals working from the shadows, their influence felt everywhere, but their names known almost nowhere? This is the story of the invisible class, the merchants, the traders, the financiers whose silent deals and cunning strategies built fortunes, funded wars, and quietly redirected the flow of human history itself. While emperors took the credit, these master manipulators of money and supply chains were often the ones pulling the strings, accumulating power so discreetly that we're only just beginning to uncover their full impact. From the ancient spice routes that connected continents to the complex banking networks of Renaissance Europe, these merchants operated in a world of calculated risks and whispered alliances. They weren't just selling goods, they were crafting the economic foundations upon which empires either stood tall or crumbled into dust. They loaned money to kings who needed to fund their armies. They controlled resources that nations depended on, and they forged connections across cultures that diplomats could only dream of. Yet, despite their enormous role, they preferred to remain in the background, out of sight, out of mind, but never out of influence. Their legacy is all around us, embedded in the very structures of global trade and politics that define our modern world. Yet their stories remain some of history's best-kept secrets. So today, we're pulling back the curtain on these elusive figures. We'll journey through time and across oceans to explore how these merchants shaped everything from the rise of Rome to the expansion of the British Empire, and how their behind-the-scenes maneuvering still affects the balance of power today. You'll discover how a handful of spices could dictate the fate of dynasties, how a family of bankers could bankroll entire wars, and how networks of trust and trade could quietly reshape civilizations. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a revelation of the hidden forces that have always moved the world. So settle in and open your mind, because we're about to uncover how commerce, more than conquest, carved the contours of our past and set the stage for the world we live in now. So who exactly were these shadowy figures operating behind the grand narratives of emperors and empires? The term invisible class doesn't refer to a secret society in the literal sense, but rather to a diverse collection of merchants, financiers, and commercial intermediaries who mastered the art of operating just below the radar of official history. They were the wholesalers who moved vast quantities of goods without ever appearing in royal chronicles, the bankers who funded crown projects without seeking public recognition, and the cross-cultural brokers who facilitated exchanges between civilizations while leaving minimal paper trails. Their invisibility was often deliberate, a strategic choice to avoid scrutiny, taxation, and the dangerous attentions of jealous rulers. While monarchs built palaces and monuments to cement their legacies, these merchants built networks. Their power resided not in land or titles, but in relationships, information, and liquidity. They cultivated trust across great distances through family alliances and ethnic communities, creating reliable systems of credit and communication that could stretch from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. A merchant in Venice might extend credit to a cousin in Alexandria based on nothing but a handwritten letter and a family reputation, demonstrating how personal bonds undergirded global commerce centuries before modern banking. These operators understood that true influence often flourishes in the shadows, away from the volatile world of court politics and succession wars. They preferred to let kings and generals take the credit for victories while they quietly managed the supply chains that made those victories possible, funded the treasuries that paid the soldiers, and eventually collected the debts that gave them leverage over the very rulers who supposedly held all the power. Their legacy is everywhere in our historical infrastructure, from the standardized weights and measures that enabled trade across cultures to the financial instruments like letters of credit that fueled economic expansion, yet we rarely learn their names in school. By making themselves indispensable but unobtrusive, they became the silent partners to power, the hidden architects whose commercial ingenuity shaped the world far more profoundly than many of the famous figures who dominate our history books. To understand the magnitude of their influence, we must journey back to the very cradle of civilization itself. Long before the age of sprawling empires, the quiet hum of commerce was already at work, weaving together the earliest threads of human society. In the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia, the Indus, and the Nile, the first merchants were not just peddlers of goods, they were the vital circulatory system for these nascent cultures. They moved essential commodities like grain from regions of plenty to areas of scarcity, transported sturdy textiles for clothing and sails, and facilitated the exchange of precious metals like silver and copper, which would become the foundation of early monetary systems. This wasn't merely about profit, it was about survival and growth on a societal scale. The ability to reliably obtain resources from beyond one's immediate horizon allowed villages to swell into towns and towns to evolve into the world's first great cities like and Mohenjo-Daro. These urban centers, with their concentrations of people, wealth, and power, simply could not have been sustained without the intricate supply chains managed by these pioneering traders. Their role, however, extended far beyond basic logistics. These merchants were also the original vectors for the most valuable cargo of all, ideas and innovation. A trader from Sumer might introduce new metallurgical techniques to the Egyptians in exchange for papyrus, while a Harappan merchant could bring novel architectural concepts back from Mesopotamia. This constant, low-level exchange of knowledge accelerated technological progress across vast distances, fostering advancements in writing, mathematics, and engineering that were crucial for administrative control and large-scale construction. The cuneiform tablets we study today, which detail laws and royal decrees, often began their life as accounting records for merchant ventures. In this way, the very tools that empowered kings to rule were born from the practical needs of commerce. The merchant's caravan and the merchant's ship were, in effect, mobile universities and news services, connecting disparate cultures and creating a shared pool of human knowledge that was entirely separate from royal proclamations or military conquests. As these networks solidified, the most successful merchants began to accumulate a new form of power that was not dependent on land or heredity: immense social capital. A merchant who could consistently supply a city-state with grain during a famine or provide a pharaoh with the Lebanese cedar needed for his funerary barge became indispensable. This indispensability translated into influence. Wealthy traders were often called upon to advise rulers on economic matters, and they learned to leverage their resources to gain even greater favor. They might fund the construction of a new temple, a public granary, or a section of city walls, highly visible projects that served the community while simultaneously broadcasting the merchant's generosity and importance. This philanthropy was a brilliant strategy. It built goodwill among the populace and created a debt of gratitude with the ruling class, granting the merchant a degree of protection and access that was otherwise unavailable to commoners. They were weaving themselves into the very fabric of power, becoming the quiet, essential partners to the thrones they seemed to serve. This ancient period, therefore, was not a simple prelude to later history. It was the foundational era where the blueprint for merchant influence was first drawn. The patterns established of creating economic interdependence, facilitating cultural exchange, and converting wealth into social and political capital would be repeated and refined for millennia. The humble traders of the ancient world laid the groundwork for everything that was to come, proving that long before a king could command an army, he first needed a merchant to ensure that army could be fed, paid, and equipped. The story of empire begins not with a crown but with a trade route. But to truly grasp the scale of this network, we have to let go of the image of a single, well-defined road. The Silk Road was never one path but a sprawling, shifting web of overland trails and maritime passages, a chaotic and organic system that ebbed and flowed with the seasons, politics, and sheer human ingenuity. It was less a highway and more a circulatory system for the entire Eurasian continent, with merchants acting as the vital red blood cells, carrying the oxygen of commerce and culture to its farthest reaches. These traders rarely, if ever, traveled the entire distance from Rome to Chang'an. Instead, they mastered the art of relay trade. A merchant in Persia might acquire fine glassware, transport it to the bustling markets of Samarkand, and sell it to a colleague from the Tarim Basin, who would then carry it further east, each leg of the journey adding value and layering on profit. This decentralized model was its genius. It distributed risk and built a resilient system where no single empire's collapse could sever the entire network. Goods, and more importantly ideas, could detour around wars and famines, finding new paths like water flowing around a stone, ensuring that the exchange never truly stopped. And what an exchange it was! While luxury items like Chinese silk and Roman glass captured the imagination and the high profits, the real story was in the movement of the mundane and the revolutionary. A caravan might be carrying sacks of peppercorns and bolts of damask silk, but tucked away in those same saddlebags were technologies that would alter the course of civilizations. The secret of papermaking, discovered in China, slowly traveled west, eventually reaching the Islamic world and then Europe, where it would democratize knowledge and fuel the Renaissance. Advanced astronomical charts and navigational techniques from Indian and Arab merchants found their way onto the ships of others, enabling safer travel and more accurate mapping of the world. Even something as seemingly simple as the stirrup, which radically changed warfare by giving mounted soldiers a stable platform to fight from, was likely disseminated along these merchant trails. This was the ultimate hidden cargo, not just spices for a nobleman's table, but the very building blocks of future scientific and cultural revolutions, all moving under the commercial radar. Of course, this vast, unofficial system didn't operate in a legal vacuum. It thrived precisely because its merchant architects became masters of navigating and manipulating the political landscapes they crossed. They understood that a border was not just a line on a map but a revenue opportunity for a local official. Bribery was simply a cost of doing business, a lubricant for the wheels of commerce. A well-placed bribe could turn a hostile checkpoint into a safe passage, or a suspicious customs officer into a valuable informant about market conditions ahead. Beyond mere bribes, these merchants formed sophisticated alliances with regional powers. They provided rulers with intelligence from distant lands, offered loans to fund local projects, and supplied exotic goods that boosted a king's prestige. In return, they received protected status, favorable tax rates, and sometimes even armed escorts. This symbiotic relationship meant that the merchant networks became deeply embedded in the political fabric of the continent, making them indispensable to the very empires that nominally controlled the territories they traversed. They were the ultimate intermediaries operating in the gray area between nations, building an invisible infrastructure of trust and mutual benefit that was far more durable than any single treaty. The legacy of their success is written in the names of legendary cities that rose from mere oases or ports to become cosmopolitan nerve centers of global exchange. Take Samarkand, a name that still echoes with mystery and wealth. Located at the heart of Central Asia, it was the quintessential Silk Road city, a place where Sogdian merchants from Persia negotiated with Turkish nomads and Chinese officials under the watchful eyes of local rulers. Its markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world, and its streets were a cacophony of languages, religions, and cultures. The wealth generated from controlling this crossroads funded magnificent architecture, advanced scholarship, and a level of urban sophistication that rivaled any contemporary European capital. Similarly, Constantinople thrived as the western terminus, its vaulted marketplaces acting as the final distribution point for Eastern luxuries heading into Europe. The economic power concentrated in these hubs gave their merchant classes enormous influence, often allowing them to sway royal policy and dictate terms of trade. These cities were the physical embodiment of the Silk Road's success, monuments not to a single conqueror, but to the collective power of commerce and connection, proving that the most enduring empires are often those built not on conquest, but on exchange. While the Silk Road thrived on the exchange of tangible goods across continents, a different kind of revolution was brewing in the city-states of medieval Italy and the bustling textile hubs of Flanders. Here, the very concept of value itself was being reinvented, not by kings or philosophers, but by a new breed of merchant financiers. They realized that the future of power lay not in the physical movement of spices or silk, but in the abstract movement of money and credit. Families with names like Medici in Florence and Fugger in Augsburg began to shift their focus from what they traded to how they traded, pioneering financial instruments that would become the bedrock of the modern global economy. Their most transformative innovation was the bill of exchange, a seemingly simple piece of paper that was in fact a revolutionary tool. Imagine a merchant in Florence needing to pay a wool supplier in Bruges. Instead of risking the transport of heavy, vulnerable chests of gold coins across bandit-infested roads, he could deposit his money with a local banker. The banker would provide him with a bill of exchange, a letter of credit, which the merchant could then present to the banker's associate in Bruges to receive the exact amount in local currency. This system not only solved the practical problem of moving money, but also created a powerful new commodity, trust itself, tradable across vast distances. This new financial architecture required a language of its own, a way to track the increasingly complex web of credits, debits, and obligations. The answer emerged from the ledgers of these merchant houses, double-entry bookkeeping. This wasn't just a minor accounting upgrade, it was a fundamental shift in perception. For the first time, every transaction had two equal and opposite effects, creating a perfect closed system of accountability. A sale on one page became an asset on another, a loan given was a debt received. This meticulous balancing act did more than just prevent fraud. It provided a crystal-clear, real-time snapshot of an entire commercial empire's health. A Medici partner could look at a ledger and instantly understand the profitability of their London branch, the liquidity of their Venice office, and the overall solvency of their entire network. This clarity and control were unprecedented. It turned commerce from a speculative gamble into a manageable science, allowing these families to assess risk, allocate capital, and plan for the future with a precision that most royal treasuries could only dream of. Their ledgers, often more accurate than any royal census, became the true maps of European power. With these powerful new tools at their disposal, these banking families quickly became the indispensable creditors to the most powerful figures in Europe. Crowns were perpetually cash poor, weighed down by the immense costs of warfare, coronations, and displays of royal magnificence. When a king needed to field an army or a pope sought to fund a new basilica, they turned to the Fuggers and the Medicis, not their own nobility. This relationship flipped the traditional script of power entirely. The banker, once a mere subject, now held the purse strings to empire. A loan came with strings attached, often in the form of lucrative concessions. The Fugger family, for instance, financed the election of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor, an enormous expense that essentially bought them the right to oversee papal finances and manage incredibly profitable silver and copper mines in Tyrol and Hungary. They weren't just lending money, they were purchasing revenue streams and carving out economic monopolies for themselves. The Medici, through their support of the papacy, gained control of the alum mines essential for dyeing textiles, giving them a stranglehold on a key industry. The threat of calling in a debt could make emperors hesitate and popes reconsider their policies. Financial leverage had become a more potent weapon than any army. The true source of their influence, however, lay in their network. These were not solitary moneylenders but the CEOs of the world's first multinational corporations. They established branches and appointed trusted agents, often family members, in every major commercial center from London to Constantinople. This network was a dual-purpose marvel. It was both a financial web for moving capital and an intelligence network for gathering information. Their couriers, often traveling ahead of diplomatic envoys, provided them with crucial news about harvests, political unrest, impending wars, and market fluctuations. This inside information was a form of currency more valuable than gold. Knowing about a poor grain harvest in Castile before anyone else allowed them to buy up future supplies or adjust credit terms. Hearing a rumor of a king's illness let them speculate on succession crises. This flow of information allowed them to broker not just deals but entire peace treaties, using their financial influence and their unique position as neutral intermediaries to bring warring factions to the table. They shaped the fiscal policies of nations from behind the scenes, advising on taxation, currency devaluation, and public debt, effectively writing the playbook for modern state finance. In doing so, they demonstrated that the most effective way to build an empire was not always to conquer land, but to control the capital and information that made conquest possible. Far to the north of the Mediterranean's financial revolutions, a different model of merchant power was taking shape, one built not on the genius of a single family but on the collective strength of an alliance. The Hanseatic League, or Hanse, began not as a formal state but as a loose association of German-speaking towns and merchant guilds, bound together by a simple, powerful goal: to protect their trade and maximize their profits in the rough and tumble world of the Baltic and North Seas. Imagine a network of ports from London in the west to Novgorod in the east, where a merchant from Cologne could expect the same rights and protections in Riga as he had at home. This was the Hanse's incredible achievement. It created a common commercial legal zone across Northern Europe, a unified economic space that functioned seamlessly across the fractured political map of kingdoms, duchies, and bishoprics. Their symbol, the cog ship, became a familiar and reassuring sight in harbors from Bruges to Bergen, representing not just a vessel but a guarantee of quality, fair dealing, and collective security. This wasn't an empire in the traditional sense. It had no emperor, no single capital, and no grand army of conquest. Instead, its capital was wherever its merchants gathered, and its power was derived from a shared commitment to mutual economic benefit, proving that a common purpose could be as strong a unifying force as a crown. The League's authority rested on three formidable pillars: economic dominance, diplomatic cunning, and a reluctant but proven willingness to use force. Their primary tool was the strategic establishment of trading posts known as kontor in foreign cities. These were not just simple warehouses but fortified compounds, mini-city-states within a city, where Hanseatic merchants lived under their own laws, judged their own disputes, and enjoyed sweeping tax exemptions negotiated directly with local rulers. The kontor in Novgorod, for instance, was a walled enclave with its own church, bakery, and bathhouse, a self-sufficient German island in a Russian river. In London, the Steelyard was a similar fortress of commerce, granted extraordinary privileges by English kings desperate for access to the League's vast network of goods. Through these outposts, the Hanse established a near-total monopoly on the most sought-after commodities of the north. They controlled the flow of Prussian grain and timber, Norwegian stockfish, Swedish iron, and most famously, the exquisite amber from the Baltic coast. By controlling the entire supply chain, from extraction to transport to final sale, they could dictate prices, freeze out competitors, and make entire regions dependent on their logistical prowess. When economic pressure wasn't enough, the League's Diet, its assembly of representatives from member cities, could authorize more direct action. They maintained a powerful navy, not for territorial expansion, but for economic enforcement, a fleet of privateers ready to become warships. They famously waged war against the Kingdom of Denmark, not to conquer land but to break a king who dared to threaten their privileges and interfere with their shipping lanes. Their victory was not sealed with a treaty of surrender but with the Treaty of Stralsund in 1370, a document that stands as a stunning testament to merchant power. The defeated Danish king was forced to grant the Hanseatic League the right to approve future Danish monarchs, effectively giving a coalition of fish and timber merchants a veto power over the Crown of Denmark. This was the ultimate expression of their influence. They didn't need to occupy the throne when they could decide who sat on it. Their interventions in succession disputes across Scandinavia and the Baltic were calculated moves to ensure the ascension of rulers who would be favorable, or better yet, indebted to their commercial interests, making them the ultimate kingmakers operating from the counting houses and guild halls of their member cities. The true legacy of the Hanseatic League, however, lies in its revolutionary structure. It demonstrated that sovereignty could be fragmented and that political authority was not the only path to power. For centuries, it operated as a de facto merchant republic, a confederation that challenged the very notion that power must be centralized under a monarch. Cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen became incredibly wealthy and powerful, their skylines dominated not by royal castles but by the grand brick churches and guild halls paid for by trade. The League created its own courts, its own diplomatic corps, and its own system of resolving disputes between members, all without reference to a higher feudal authority. It showed that economic alliances built on contracts and mutual interest could be more resilient and more adaptable than the fragile dynastic marriages and feudal oaths that held traditional kingdoms together. Their slow decline came not from military defeat, but from the same forces of change they had mastered: the rise of powerful centralized states like England and the Netherlands, who began to challenge their monopolies, and the shifting of trade routes to the Atlantic. Yet, their story remains a powerful lesson in how commerce, when organized collectively, could not just support empires but effectively become one, rewriting the rules of geopolitics and proving that the flow of goods could be as decisive as the flow of armies in shaping the destiny of nations. While the Hanseatic League dominated the cold northern seas with its collective might, a far more ancient and organic web of commerce was thriving in the warm, monsoon-driven waters of the Indian Ocean. Here, the power of the merchant was not in fortified guild halls but in a deep, intimate knowledge of nature's rhythms. For centuries, Arab, Persian, Indian, and later Southeast Asian mariners had mastered an incredible natural clockwork, the seasonal monsoon winds. They understood that for 6 months of the year, the winds would blow steadily from the southwest, carrying their laden ships from the Arabian Peninsula to the coasts of India and Africa. Then, as if on a divine schedule, the winds would reverse for the next 6 months, blowing from the northeast to bring them home. This predictable pattern allowed for journeys of astonishing distance and regularity, transforming the Indian Ocean from a terrifying barrier into a bustling maritime highway. It was a system so reliable that merchants could plan multi-year trading expeditions with a confidence that their overland counterparts, at the mercy of bandits and shifting political alliances, could never possess. The monsoon was the true engine of this trade, and the merchants were its master mechanics, harnessing the very breath of the planet to weave together a world. The cargo moving along these routes was the stuff of legend, destined for the courts of caliphs and emperors. Spices were the undisputed kings of this commerce. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon, sourced from the lush islands of Southeast Asia and the Malabar coast of India, were worth their weight in gold in the markets of Cairo and Venice. But the holds of these ships also glittered with precious gems from Sri Lankan mines, were weighted with bulk commodities like Indian cotton textiles that clothed millions across the Indian Ocean rim, and were scented with rare perfumes and incenses from Arabia and East Africa. This was not a simple point-to-point trade. A single ship might follow a complex route, picking up ivory and gold in the Swahili city-states of Africa, exchanging it for cotton in Gujarat, then using those profits to acquire spices in Sumatra before catching the monsoon back to Oman. The entire system was a masterpiece of arbitrage, with value increasing at every port of call, generating wealth on a scale that would stupefy most medieval European monarchs. The prosperity of entire civilizations, from the glittering Sultanate of Malacca to the powerful Vijayanagara Empire in India, was fundamentally built upon their access to this aquatic Silk Road. What truly set this network apart, however, was its reliance on an invisible infrastructure of trust and kinship that completely bypassed the need for political empires to manage it. Unlike the Hanseatic League with its formal treaties, the Indian Ocean trade flourished through diaspora communities. A Persian merchant from Hormuz would settle in a port city like Calicut on India's coast, marrying locally and raising a family. His son would grow up fluent in multiple languages and cultures, perfectly positioned to act as a trusted agent for other merchants from his father's homeland. Deals worth fortunes were made on nothing more than a spoken promise and the reputation of a family name. This system of extended family and ethnic credit was underpinned by sophisticated financial instruments like the SAC, an early form of check and complex partnership agreements that spread risk across multiple investors. A ship's voyage might be funded by a dozen different backers from different ports, each taking a share of the profit in return for assuming a portion of the potential loss. This decentralized, trust-based network was incredibly resilient. While land-based empires rose and fell, the trade routes hummed along, adapting to new players and shifting powers because the connections were personal and commercial, not political. The merchants created a stateless world of their own, a hidden commercial republic that floated upon the ocean. The cultural exchange facilitated by these merchants was perhaps their most enduring legacy. They were the original globalizers, carrying far more than just goods in their wooden dhows. As they moved, they became conduits for ideas, faiths, and technologies. Arab and Persian traders brought Islam to the shores of Indonesia and East Africa, where it took root and blended with local traditions to create unique cultural syntheses that endure to this day. Indian merchants carried Hinduism and Buddhism across to Southeast Asia, inspiring the construction of breathtaking temples like Angkor Wat and Borobudur. The very languages of trade became creolized, with words from Arabic, Persian, and Malay mixing to form lingua francas like Swahili on the African coast, a language whose name literally means "of the coast." Technologically, the exchange was just as profound. Shipbuilding techniques from the Arabian Gulf merged with designs from India and China, leading to the development of the robust, massive tonnage dhow that could weather long ocean voyages. Navigational knowledge, including the use of the astrolabe and detailed navigational charts, was shared and refined in port cities from Zanzibar to Canton. This constant, informal exchange of knowledge happened in the harbors and marketplaces, a side effect of commerce that ultimately did more to shape the modern world than any single imperial decree. This vibrant, successful, and largely self-regulating system, however, could not escape the notice of outsiders forever. The very wealth it generated acted as a beacon, drawing European explorers around the coast of Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries. When Vasco da Gama finally reached the coast of India in 1498, he did not arrive in a blank slate or a primitive backwater. He stumbled into the midst of a complex, thriving, and ancient economic world that he scarcely understood. His initial guides were Muslim merchants who knew these routes intimately. The Europeans, first the Portuguese and then the Dutch and English, were the disruptive newcomers. They looked upon this trust-based, decentralized network and saw not sophistication but a lack of control. They brought with them a new model, the armed trading post and the state-sponsored monopoly company, backed by cannonballs and sheer violent force. The merchant princes of the Indian Ocean, who had operated for centuries on mutual benefit and negotiation, were suddenly confronted by actors who preferred coercion to commerce. In this way, the pre-existing pathways of the Indian Ocean traders, the very routes they had painstakingly mapped over a millennium, became the blueprint for European colonial domination. The invisible networks built by unseen mariners ultimately showed the Europeans exactly where to go and what to take, proving that the lines of global connection, once established by commerce, are all too easily converted into lines of imperial control. But to truly grasp the power of these merchant guilds, we need to see them not as dry historical institutions, but as something far more potent: the original secret societies of commerce. Imagine a world without standardized laws or reliable courts, where a trader venturing into a foreign city was fair game for arbitrary taxes, confiscation, or worse. The Guild was the answer to this chaos, a private, members-only club that offered a shield against a hostile world. For a merchant, receiving the Guild's membership was like gaining a passport and an insurance policy rolled into one. It guaranteed him safe passage, fair arbitration in disputes with fellow members, and critically, the exclusive right to trade in specific, highly lucrative goods. In London, the worshipful company of grocers controlled the spice trade. In Paris, the Guild of Mercers held sway over fine textiles and silks. This wasn't just about organizing business. It was about carving out a protected economic territory, a legal sanctuary where the rules were written by and for the merchants themselves, creating islands of order in the turbulent seas of medieval and early modern economies. The inner workings of these guilds were designed to foster an unbreakable loyalty that often superseded allegiance to king or country. Admission was a solemn affair, far more than just paying dues. It involved elaborate initiation ceremonies, sacred oaths sworn on religious relics, and the sharing of ritual meals, practices that bound members together in a sacred brotherhood of profit. These rituals were psychological genius. They transformed a simple business association into a band of brothers, creating a level of trust that allowed for incredible financial cooperation. A guildsman from Genoa could extend credit to a fellow member in Alexandria based solely on their shared affiliation, knowing the entire weight of the guild stood behind that debt. This trust enabled them to pool resources for massive, high-risk ventures like equipping a caravan for the Silk Road or funding a ship to the Baltic, ventures that would be unthinkable for an individual trader. Internally, they operated their own courts, settling commercial disputes with a speed and expertise that royal courts could never match. This self-regulation was a powerful tool. It kept their dirty laundry private, prevented external authorities from meddling in their affairs, and presented a united, impenetrable front to the outside world. This formidable unity gave guilds their most potent weapon, the power to lobby and manipulate the highest levels of political power. Kings and emperors, perpetually short of cash for their wars and building projects, found themselves constantly knocking on the guild hall doors for loans. The guilds, with their vast pooled capital, were happy to oblige, but always for a price. That price was rarely simple interest, it was influence. A large loan might be exchanged for a royal charter granting the guild a total monopoly on the wool trade, effectively making them the only legal buyer and seller of England's most valuable export. Another might secure a reduction in export duties, putting their goods at a permanent advantage. They became master lobbyists, whispering in the ears of finance ministers and drafting legislation that favored their interests. A king seeking to raise taxes might suddenly find his proposal blocked by a parliamentary faction quietly funded by the merchant guilds, or discover that the silver he needed to pay his soldiers was suddenly harder to come by from the guild-controlled mines. They learned to play the Game of Thrones with cold, calculating precision, demonstrating that economic power could bend political power to its will, often making the guild masters the true architects of fiscal policy while the crown merely took the credit. The ultimate expression of their power, however, was the monopoly. By controlling who could trade and what they could trade, guilds could strangle supply chains and dictate prices across entire regions. Imagine the spice trade flowing into Europe. It didn't arrive through a free market. It was meticulously funneled through the hands of a few privileged guilds who had secured the rights from various monarchs. They could artificially limit the supply of pepper or cinnamon arriving in Venice, sending prices skyrocketing and reaping astronomical profits. They enforced these monopolies ruthlessly. An independent merchant known as an interloper, caught trying to sell silk without guild authorization, could face crippling fines, have his goods confiscated, or even be thrown in prison. This control extended backwards into production as well. Guilds often set strict standards for quality and, more importantly, limited the number of apprentices a master could take on, effectively capping the supply of new craftsmen and keeping the circle of privilege small and exclusive. This wasn't just about maximizing wealth. It was about constructing a closed system that perpetuated their own power, generation after generation, creating an economic elite whose influence was felt in every market and every treasury, yet whose meetings were held behind closed doors, their decisions recorded in secret ledgers, their true impact hidden in plain sight. Yet for all the financial and political power of the guilds, their influence was ultimately channeled into a single, all-consuming pursuit that would redefine the world: the quest for flavor. It is almost impossible to overstate the sheer, intoxicating power that spices held over the European imagination. In an age before refrigeration, where winter meals were often monotonous and salted meats were a necessity, a pinch of pepper or a fragment of nutmeg was not just a luxury, it was a portal to another world. These exotic aromas evoked the mythical lands of the East described by Marco Polo, symbols of status, refinement, and almost magical properties. But beyond the culinary desire lay a powerful economic reality. The markups were staggering. A sack of peppercorns purchased in Calicut could be sold in Venice for 60 times its original price. A single cargo of cloves could make every investor in the voyage an instant millionaire. This wasn't just trade, it was alchemy, and the merchants who understood the complex, dangerous supply chains were the alchemists, turning base commodities into pure gold, and in the process becoming the hidden architects of the age of exploration. These merchants were the vital intelligence behind the great voyages of discovery. While we remember the names of explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus, it was often anonymous spice traders who provided the crucial maps, the whispered rumors of monsoon patterns, and the fragments of knowledge about distant markets. They were the ones who could look at a crude chart and point to the precise islands in the Moluccas, the fabled spice islands where nutmeg and cloves grew wild. They understood that the key to breaking the Venetian and Arab monopolies was not to fight over the old land routes, but to find a new way to the source by sea. This merchant-class knowledge is what made the Portuguese gamble of sailing around Africa possible. They weren't sailing blindly into the unknown. They were following a commercial treasure map with the scent of profit as their true North Star. Every caravel that rounded the Cape of Good Hope was, in essence, a merchant vessel on a corporate raid, its mission to intercept the spice trade at its origin and redirect that river of wealth back to Lisbon. The success of this direct access unleashed a new, more aggressive form of merchant power, the armed trading post. The Portuguese established a network of fortified ports from Goa in India to Malacca in Malaysia. These were not friendly trading colonies but militarized choke points designed to control the flow of spices at gunpoint. The merchant had evolved from a negotiator into a garrison commander. They would force local producers to sell exclusively to them at dictated prices, and any other trader, especially Arab or Indian merchants who had dominated the routes for centuries, was considered an interloper, and their ships were subject to seizure or sinking. This shift from commerce to coercion marked a dark turning point. The pursuit of flavor now justified incredible violence. The capture of Malacca in 1511 was a bloody affair, but for the Portuguese crown and its merchant backers, it was a brilliant strategic move, giving them control over the narrow strait through which all the spice-laden shipping from the east had to pass. The most devastating consequence of this spice-driven frenzy was the calculated destruction of indigenous economies and the displacement of populations. The merchants and their state sponsors were not interested in fair trade. They sought total control. In the Banda Islands, the only place in the world where nutmeg grew, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, enacted a policy of horror to maintain their monopoly. They systematically killed or enslaved nearly the entire native population of 15,000 people to prevent them from selling nutmeg to anyone else. They then divided the islands into plantations, worked by enslaved peoples brought from elsewhere and guarded by Dutch soldiers. A single tree, whose fruit had once been part of a local ecosystem and economy, was now a state asset protected by genocide. This pattern repeated itself wherever a valuable spice grew. The quest for cinnamon led to the Dutch taking control of Ceylon, for pepper to their dominance of parts of Java. The land itself was rewritten as a factory, its people seen merely as instruments or obstacles to production, all to ensure that a wealthy housewife in Amsterdam could flavor her pudding with a spice that had cost a fortune in human suffering. In the end, the story of the spice trade is the ultimate testament to the merchants' role as a catalyst for empire. Their demand created the economic incentive for Europe to look outward. Their capital funded the ships that mapped the globe. Their logistical networks became the frameworks for the first colonial administrations. The powerful trading companies they formed, like the English and Dutch East India Companies, were essentially privatized empires, granted the power to wage war, make treaties, and govern territories, all in the name of securing a favorable balance of trade. These companies started with spices but quickly expanded their portfolios to include textiles, tea, opium, and ultimately, the control of land and people. The humble merchant, once a traveler seeking profit through exchange, had become the engine of a system that would reshape the demographics, politics, and economies of entire continents for centuries. The flavor that once graced a king's table had become the reason for raising a flag on a distant shore, proving that the most world-altering ambitions can sometimes begin with the simplest of human desires, the craving for something tastier. But the story of the spice trade finds its ultimate expression in an entity so vast and powerful that it redefined the very nature of commerce and conquest. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, known to history as the Dutch East India Company or VOC, was a creation unlike anything the world had ever seen. It's crucial to understand that the VOC was not merely a company in the way we think of one today. It was, in effect, a sovereign nation operating under a corporate banner. The Dutch government granted it a breathtaking charter, the power to build forts, maintain armies and navies, wage war, imprison and execute convicts, and negotiate binding treaties with foreign rulers. This was a megacorporation with a license to engage in imperialism, blurring the line between a commercial venture and a state so completely that its actions would dictate foreign policy for the Netherlands for nearly 2 centuries. It became a state within a state, an entity whose flag flew over territories from the Cape of Good Hope to the islands of Japan, and whose primary loyalty was not to a people or a principle, but to the bottom line. The true power, however, did not reside in the charter itself, but in the hands of the men who controlled it. The VOC was governed by the Heren Roman 17, the Lords 17, a board of directors drawn from the wealthiest and most influential merchant families of Amsterdam and other Dutch cities. These were the hidden masters of the first corporate empire. They rarely, if ever, set foot in the exotic lands they controlled. Instead, they operated from a quiet, unassuming building in Amsterdam, making world-altering decisions based on ledgers, shipping manifests, and market reports. Their meetings were dominated by discussions of profit margins, commodity prices, and logistical efficiency, not ethics or the well-being of distant populations. A famine in Ceylon was assessed not as a humanitarian crisis but as a potential disruption to the cinnamon supply. An uprising in the Spice Islands was a problem of security costs and lost productivity. For the Heren Roman 17, the entire Indian Ocean was a complex chessboard, and people, resources, and even entire kingdoms were merely pieces to be moved in the service of maximizing shareholder value. To manage this globe-spanning operation, the VOC pioneered organizational and financial innovations that would become the bedrock of modern capitalism. They perfected double-entry bookkeeping on an unprecedented scale, creating a system of accountability that allowed them to track the profitability of individual outposts and voyages with remarkable precision. They issued tradable shares to the public, creating the world's first true stock market and democratizing investment in colonial exploitation. This shareholder structure, while revolutionary, also created a relentless pressure for quarterly dividends, forcing the company to pursue ever more aggressive and often brutal methods to ensure a steady flow of profits. Their massive, purpose-built merchant ships known as East Indiamen were among the most advanced vessels of their time, capable of carrying vast cargoes and outfitted with enough cannon to fend off most naval threats. This combination of financial ingenuity, bureaucratic organization, and sheer naval power created a machine of commerce that was terrifyingly efficient and utterly ruthless in its pursuit of market dominance. The legacy of the VOC is a profoundly contradictory one. On one hand, it was an astonishing feat of human organization, a testament to the power of pooled capital and logistical planning that genuinely did help weave the world together for better and for worse. It established trade routes and connections that still exist today. On the other hand, its methods were a blueprint for corporate atrocity. To enforce its monopolies on nutmeg and cloves, the VOC engaged in what we would now call genocide and ethnic cleansing in the Banda Islands, systematically exterminating or enslaving the local population to replace them with more controllable plantation workers. It used slave labor extensively, and its officials were notorious for corruption and extortion. The VOC's story demonstrates the ultimate potential of merchant power unleashed without ethical restraint, proving that a corporation, when granted the powers of a state, can act with all the violence of an empire while being driven solely by the cold, calculating logic of profit. Its eventual bankruptcy in the late 18th century was not due to a failure of its model, but to its very success. The corruption and greed it institutionalized became so endemic that it consumed the company from within, a stark and early warning about the perils of unchecked corporate power that still resonates today. Yet for all the corporate power of the VOC, another merchant-driven enterprise was emerging that would eclipse even its horrors in scale and human cost. An enterprise so brutal it forces us to confront the darkest capabilities of commerce when utterly divorced from morality. The transatlantic slave trade was not a side project or a minor footnote in economic history. It was one of the largest and most complex logistical operations the world had ever seen, and it was designed, financed, and operated almost entirely by merchants. These were not rogue actors or outliers. They were often respected pillars of their communities in port cities like Liverpool, Nantes, and Rhode Island. Men who worshipped in churches on Sunday and on Monday calculated the profit margins on human cargo. They saw enslaved Africans not as people but as a commodity, the most lucrative unit of labor ever traded. The entire system, from the forts on the West African coast to the auction blocks in the Americas, was a meticulously engineered machine for the production of wealth, and its architects were the merchants who understood how to turn human suffering into cold, hard currency. The genius, a term we use here with profound unease of these merchants, lay in their ability to industrialize this horror through sophisticated business structures and financial innovation. The slave trade was one of the earliest examples of a global supply chain, and it required immense capital. To fund these voyages, merchants created complex partnerships, spreading the enormous risk across dozens of investors. A ship's journey was broken down into a series of financial instruments. Insurance policies were taken out on the cargo, the human beings, against the risk of revolt or disease at sea. Futures contracts were sold on the cotton and sugar those enslaved people would produce upon arrival. Banks in London and Amsterdam provided letters of credit to slave ship captains, while investors back home could buy shares in a specific voyage, receiving a portion of the profits upon its successful, which is to say, deadly completion. This financialization of human bondage meant that the entire economy of the Atlantic world became entangled in the trade. The merchant who never set foot on a ship was just as complicit as the captain. The insurer who collected a premium on a human life was a vital cog in the machine, and the banker who facilitated the transfer of funds enabled the entire grotesque operation to function with a chilling efficiency. The impact of this merchant-engineered system was catastrophic, embedding itself into the very foundations of the modern world. The agricultural economies of the American South, the Caribbean, and Brazil were built entirely on this model of enslaved labor, generating unprecedented wealth for plantation owners and the merchants who supplied them. This wealth didn't just stay in the colonies, it flowed back to Europe, financing the Industrial Revolution, building grand civic buildings in port cities, and endowing universities. The economic boom that lifted Europe and North America in the 18th and 19th centuries was to a terrifying degree funded by the interest on this human debt. Furthermore, the trade required a justification, which merchants and the states that protected them found in the deliberate construction of rigid racial hierarchies. To justify the brutalization of millions, an ideology of white supremacy was cultivated and codified into law, creating a legacy of systemic racism and inequality whose scars are painfully visible to this day. The merchants' pursuit of profit didn't just shape economies, it poisoned societies, creating divisions and injustices that nations are still struggling to overcome centuries later. Confronting this chapter is perhaps the most difficult but necessary task in understanding the true scope of merchant power. It reveals a terrifying capacity for abstraction, where human beings could be reduced to entries in a ledger, their screams and suffering silenced by the language of finance and the promise of dividend payments. It shows us that the same innovative spirit that could create a bill of exchange to ease trade could also devise a financial instrument to bet on the survival of a human cargo. This is the ultimate distortion of historical outcome, the creation of a world where progress for some was predicated on the utter dehumanization of others, all orchestrated from the quiet counting houses of merchants who saw the entire tragic equation not in terms of good or evil, but simply in terms of profit and loss. Their story is a stark and permanent warning about the moral vacuum that can form when economic power is pursued without any ethical anchor, reminding us that the invisible hand of the market is only as moral as the minds that guide it. Yet this calculated strategy of addiction as commerce soon met with fierce resistance from the Qing government, which saw its silver reserves hemorrhaging and its population succumbing to a debilitating scourge. The emperor appointed a stern and principled official, Lin Zexu, to confront the crisis head-on. In a dramatic and decisive act, Lin seized and destroyed millions of dollars worth of British-owned opium chests in Canton, an event that reverberated across the globe. For the Chinese, this was a righteous act of national sovereignty and public health, but for the British merchants, it was an outright destruction of private property and an intolerable obstruction of what they now framed as free trade. They immediately dispatched furious letters to London, portraying themselves not as drug pushers but as defenders of liberal economic principles, their narrative cleverly obscuring the immoral nature of their commodity. Their lobbying found a receptive audience in a British government deeply influenced by the very merchant class that dominated Parliament, setting the stage for a response that would be not diplomatic but overwhelmingly military. The resulting conflict, the First Opium War, was a grotesque mismatch of technology and intent. The British Royal Navy, its ships and strategies honed by decades of global commercial protection, descended upon the Chinese coast. Their steam-powered gunboats, immune to the whims of the wind, easily outmaneuvered the King's antiquated junks, while their superior artillery pounded coastal fortifications into rubble. This was not a war for territory in the traditional sense, but a war to force a market open. The British military objective was simple: apply enough pressure to compel the Qing court to capitulate to the merchants' demand. Every naval engagement was a negotiation by cannon fire, designed to break the will of a civilization that had once considered itself the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world. The war demonstrated with brutal clarity how the commercial ambitions of a few thousand miles away could now command the full force of a modernizing state's military apparatus, turning merchant grievances into national casus belli. The Treaty of Nanking that ended the conflict in 1842 was a document dictated by victors to a humiliated vanquished, and its terms were a merchant's fantasy. It forcibly opened 5 key Chinese ports to unfettered British trade and residence, granted Britain the island of Hong Kong in perpetuity, and imposed massive financial indemnities on China to cover the cost of the war and the destroyed opium. Most insidiously, it included a most favored nation clause, ensuring that any privilege China granted to another country would automatically extend to Britain, a provision that would soon see other Western powers extracting similar concessions without having to fire a shot. The treaty was not designed to create a colony, but to create a perfectly controlled commercial environment. It established a system of extraterritoriality, whereby British subjects in these ports were subject to British law, not Chinese, effectively creating sovereign commercial enclaves on Chinese soil where merchant activity could proceed without any reference to local authority or morality. When the Qing government later attempted to resist the continuing opium influx and reassert some control, the merchants once again cried foul, leading to the Second Opium War. This second conflict, involving an Anglo-French alliance, ended with even more punishing treaties, the legalization of the opium trade itself, and the opening of the Chinese interior to Western missionaries and merchants. The ancient Celestial Empire, with its millennia of continuous culture, had been thoroughly shackled by unequal treaties, its economy distorted to serve foreign interests and its sovereignty shattered. The Opium Wars stand as one of history's starkest examples of how the relentless pursuit of profit, when backed by state power, can literally blast open a civilization. The merchants who orchestrated this did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as pioneers of global commerce, overcoming backward obstacles. But their legacy is one of national humiliation, addiction, and the violent opening of a continent, proving that the pen of the merchant, when dipped in the ink of greed, can write declarations of war. This revolutionary shift in how the world financed its ambitions began with a simple yet brilliant concept: the joint stock company. For centuries, grand ventures like overseas expeditions or establishing a colony were the exclusive domain of kings or the very richest of noble families, simply because the cost was too astronomical for anyone else to even consider. A single ship lost at sea could bankrupt a family for generations. The joint stock model shattered this barrier. It allowed ordinary shopkeepers, prosperous farmers, and aspiring merchants, people of comfortable but not royal means, to buy a piece of the action. By selling shares of ownership in a venture to a large number of investors, these companies could amass colossal sums of capital that dwarfed any royal treasury. Suddenly, the risk of a voyage to the Spice Islands wasn't carried by 1 or 2 brave souls. It was spread across hundreds of shareholders, each only liable for the amount they had invested. This democratization of risk was the key that unlocked the modern world, transforming high-stakes gambling into calculated investment and enabling projects of a scale and scope that were previously unimaginable. The most formidable and infamous example of this new power was, without a doubt, the British East India Company. Granted a royal charter by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, it began as a typical joint stock venture, but it would evolve into something far more terrifying and influential. The charter didn't just give it a monopoly on English trade with the East. It granted the company the right to acquire territory, mint its own money, command fortresses and armies, form alliances, declare war, and administer justice. In essence, the British East India Company became a sovereign corporate state, answerable first and foremost to its shareholders and directors in London, not to the British Parliament or the Crown. It raised its own massive private armies, staffed by sepoys, Indian soldiers led by European officers, and used them to fight rival European companies and to subjugate local Indian princes. It collected taxes from millions of people, administered vast swaths of territory, and dictated economic policy for an entire subcontinent, all while being run by a board of directors whose primary legal duty was to generate a profit for its investors. This was the ultimate blurring of lines, where a for-profit corporation held the power of life and death over millions, wielding a combination of merchant agility and governmental authority that no traditional empire could match. Yet, for all its democratic promise in spreading risk, the joint stock model had a dark twin: the ruthless concentration of decision-making power. While thousands might own a few shares, true control resided with the directors and the major shareholders. A small committee in a London office meeting around a polished mahogany table could make decisions that would trigger a famine in Bengal, launch a war in Mysore, or flood the Chinese coast with opium. These men were separated by thousands of miles and layers of abstraction from the human consequences of their balance sheets. Their world was one of quarterly reports, dividend announcements, and stock prices. A decision that increased revenue was a good decision, regardless of the collateral damage it inflicted on the other side of the globe. This disconnect between those who held the power and those who felt its effects created a system that was incredibly efficient at extracting wealth, but often catastrophically blind to its human and environmental cost. The profit motive, amplified by the corporate structure, became an unstoppable force, incentivizing short-term exploitation over long-term sustainability. The legacy of this innovation is written into the very DNA of our modern global economy. The joint stock company is the direct ancestor of today's multinational corporation. The same fundamental structure, pooling capital from anonymous shareholders, limited liability, and a board of directors tasked with maximizing value, still governs the world's most powerful economic entities. The tools they pioneered, from complex corporate accounting to sophisticated lobbying of governments, are now standard practice in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Shanghai. This model built the railroads that spanned continents, funded the factories of the Industrial Revolution, and now launches satellites into orbit. Yet, the core tension they embodied remains utterly unresolved. We still grapple with the immense productive power of these entities versus the concerning concentration of influence in the hands of a few unelected executives. We debate their responsibility to shareholders versus their responsibility to society and the planet. The joint stock company was a financial invention that changed everything, proving that the most powerful engine of empire building might not be a general's sword, but a shareholder's certificate. These merchant diplomats operated in a shadow world of influence, where a carefully negotiated trade agreement could be far more impactful than any formal declaration of friendship. Unlike an official ambassador who arrived with great ceremony and was bound by strict protocols, a merchant moved with a different kind of authority, the quiet power of commercial necessity. A factory manager for the British East India Company stationed in Calcutta didn't just oversee the shipment of textiles. He spent his evenings dining with local nawabs and bankers, learning of family rivalries, overhearing concerns about tax collection, and understanding which officials were open to persuasion. He would use this intelligence not for mere gossip, but to strategically offer a loan to a cash-strapped regional ruler at a moment of vulnerability, securing in return not just repayment with interest, but exclusive trading rights or permission to build a fortified warehouse. These agreements, often sealed with a handshake and a private contract, were the true first drafts of empire, written in the language of debt and obligation long before any soldier set foot on shore. Their effectiveness stemmed from a form of cultural fluency that most official diplomats could never hope to achieve. An envoy from a European court might spend years trying to grasp the intricate etiquette of the Mughal court or the complex social hierarchies of Javanese sultanates, often making clumsy missteps along the way. A merchant, by contrast, was immersed in these details from his first day. His survival and profit depended on it. He learned which gifts were considered appropriate and which were insulting, how to frame a request as a mutual benefit rather than a demand, and the subtle art of building trust through repeated, fair dealing. This deep cultural embeddedness made him the perfect intelligence agent. He could report back to his company not just on market prices for pepper, but on the stability of the local regime, the morale of its military, and the weaknesses in its defenses. This steady stream of ground-level truth was more valuable to an expanding imperial power than any number of official dispatches from an isolated ambassador living in a compound. Nowhere was this process more clearly illustrated than in the gradual British takeover of India. The East India Company initially arrived in the 17th century as a humble petitioner, seeking permission from the powerful Mughal emperor to trade. Within a century, through the relentless work of its merchant diplomats, the company had become the kingmaker. Company agents, known as factors, forged deep alliances with individual provincial governors, providing them with funds and even European-trained military units in exchange for territorial concessions and tax-collecting rights. The pivotal moment came after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, where the company's victory was secured not just by military force, but by the prior diplomatic work of men like Robert Clive, who had negotiated the betrayal of the opposing general by promising him immense wealth. This was not a traditional war of conquest. It was a commercial enterprise using its merchant-trained personnel to execute a corporate takeover of a subcontinent, one negotiated treaty and one bought alliance at a time. Similarly, in the Indonesian archipelago, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, perfected this model of merchant-led diplomacy to create a colonial state. The VOC's merchants were masters of playing local sultans against one another. They would offer one ruler exclusive protection and a guaranteed price for his spices in exchange for ousting all other European competitors and granting the VOC a monopoly. If a ruler proved resistant, the company's merchant diplomats would simply open negotiations with his rival or his discontented younger brother, offering the same deal in exchange for support in overthrowing him. They used contracts not as agreements between equals, but as instruments of control, often written in vague terms that the Dutch could later interpret to claim even more power. The entire political landscape of the region was gradually reshaped by these commercial negotiations until the local rulers became mere puppets, their authority hollowed out by the very trade agreements that had once promised them prosperity. The merchant's pen, it turned out, could be mightier than the prince's sword, quietly drawing the borders of a new imperial order long before the mapmakers ever arrived. But if we step back from the individual merchant counting his coins and look at the sprawling, chaotic global marketplace they collectively created, a profound question emerges. How could such a decentralized, self-interested system possibly function for the benefit of all? It was a Scottish philosopher observing this very scene in the bustling ports and growing cities of the 18th century who provided the most enduring answer. Adam Smith, often called the father of modern economics, did not invent capitalism in a vacuum. Instead, he was a brilliant observer, a chronicler of the commercial revolution already being engineered by the merchant class. His famous concept of the invisible hand was less a theoretical invention and more a philosophical description of the system these traders had been building for centuries. He watched as a merchant, seeking only to make a personal profit by importing grain to sell at a high price during a shortage, would inadvertently solve the problem of famine for an entire city. The merchant's selfish motive led to a socially beneficial outcome, as if guided by an unseen force. Smith was putting a name to the quiet, collective intelligence of the market itself, an intelligence that was the direct product of millions of individual merchant decisions made every day across the globe. Smith's genius was in recognizing the patterns that merchants had long understood instinctively. He saw that their relentless pursuit of efficiency, finding a quicker shipping route, negotiating a better price with a supplier, developing a new product to meet demand, was what drove prices down and quality up for everyone. A textile merchant in Manchester, competing fiercely with his rivals, would seek out technological innovations like the spinning jenny to produce cloth more cheaply. This competition meant cheaper clothing for the public, more jobs in the factories, and wealth that rippled through the economy. None of these merchants set out to clothe the poor or fuel an industrial revolution. They simply wanted to outsell their competitor and grow their own fortune. Yet, in doing so, they became the unwitting architects of widespread prosperity and technological progress. Smith's theory gave this process a powerful intellectual framework, arguing that this bottom-up, organic organization was far more effective at allocating resources and encouraging innovation than any top-down plan devised by a royal minister or a government committee. This philosophical justification arrived at a perfect historical moment, providing the ammunition needed by a rising merchant class eager to break the remaining shackles of mercantilism. For centuries, European economies had been dominated by the idea that a nation's wealth was finite and needed to be hoarded, with governments granting monopolies, imposing high tariffs, and tightly controlling trade through complex regulations. The new merchant capitalists who had grown rich and powerful through global networks chafed against these restrictions. They argued, now with Smith's powerful ideas in their corner, for lower tariffs, fewer government-granted monopolies, and greater freedom to trade across borders. They claimed that unleashing this invisible hand would lead to greater wealth for their nations, making them more powerful and competitive on the world stage. In this way, Smith's abstract theory became a potent political tool, used to lobby for policies that would directly benefit the commercial class and further embed their influence into the very structure of emerging imperial economies, from Great Britain to the Netherlands. The legacy of this symbiotic relationship between merchant practice and economic theory is immense. Adam Smith's work, inspired by the invisible class, ultimately provided the blueprint for the modern global economy. It validated the merchant's role not as a necessary evil, but as the essential engine of national wealth and progress. His ideas helped catalyze a shift in thinking, paving the way for the Industrial Revolution by encouraging investment, innovation, and a belief in open markets. The merchant, once looked upon with suspicion as a non-productive middleman, was now recast as a vital agent of progress, his self-interest aligned with the greater good. Smith's profound insight was to articulate the system they had built, giving it a moral and intellectual foundation that would empower them to reshape the world in their image, forever linking the fate of empires to the fortunes of commerce and the relentless, invisible drive of the market. While the official histories of empires are filled with treaties signed by kings and battles won by generals, some of the most profound and lasting changes to human civilization were negotiated not in throne rooms, but in the bustling, multilingual marketplaces and crowded docksides of the world. Here, amidst the haggling over spices and the inspection of textiles, merchants were engaged in a far more subtle trade, the exchange of the very ideas that would redefine cultures. A Venetian trader might not have considered himself a diplomat of design, but when he commissioned a local artist to blend Islamic geometric patterns with European religious iconography to create a textile more appealing to his Mamluk buyers, he was actively fostering a new aesthetic. A Gujarati ship captain carrying Hindu merchants to Sumatra wasn't just transporting people. He was a vessel for belief, as those merchants established communities and built temples, introducing new gods and philosophies to the local population. This was globalization in its most organic form, driven not by imperial decree, but by the simple, daily business of finding common ground and creating products that could bridge worlds. Consider the humble yet revolutionary movement of knowledge. Islamic merchants traversing the Silk Road did more than carry silks and ceramics. They were the primary vectors for the system of Arabic numerals, including the life-changing concept of zero, which they had absorbed from Indian scholars. This numerical system, far superior to the cumbersome Roman numerals then used in Europe, slowly filtered into the trading posts of Italy and from there into the accounting houses of merchants, who immediately recognized its utility for complex calculations. Their ledgers became the textbooks that taught a new continent how to count efficiently, fundamentally enabling the advances in science, engineering, and finance that would propel Europe forward. Similarly, the precise astronomical charts and navigational techniques perfected by Arab and Persian sailors in the Indian Ocean were not kept secret. They were traded, borrowed, and improved upon by the very European rivals who would later challenge their dominance. The merchants' quest for more accurate routes to profit inadvertently mapped the heavens and the earth for all of humanity. On the other side of the globe, the Columbian exchanged the transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old and New Worlds was arguably the most consequential ecological event in human history, and it was almost entirely facilitated by merchant ships acting as unwitting arcs. European traders seeking to establish familiar foods in new colonies introduced wheat, grapes, and sugarcane to the Americas, forever altering the agricultural landscape. In return, they brought back maize, potatoes, and tomatoes to Europe, crops that would eventually boost population growth and change culinary traditions from Ireland to Italy. But this exchange was a double-edged sword, a reality that underscores the ambiguous legacy of these cultural agents. The same ships that carried new food sources also carried smallpox and measles, pathogens that decimated indigenous populations who had no immunity. Furthermore, the introduction of firearms by European traders dramatically shifted the balance of power among Native American tribes, creating violent destabilization as those with access to superior technology gained advantage over their neighbors. The merchant's cargo hold was a Pandora's box, releasing both sustenance and devastation in equal measure. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this mercantile cultural exchange is the linguistic and religious tapestry of our modern world. The Swahili language of East Africa is a living monument to this process, a beautiful Bantu language grammatically, yet overflowing with Arabic loanwords absorbed over centuries of trade along the coast. It is the language of the duka shop and the mustari customer, born on the docks of Mombasa and Zanzibar. Religions followed trade routes with a powerful inevitability. Buddhism did not reach China and Southeast Asia through military conquest but peacefully, carried by monks traveling alongside merchant caravans on the Silk Road. Islam spread through the islands of Indonesia not by the sword, but through the peaceful preaching of Muslim traders whose piety and commercial success impressed local rulers. The merchants' reputation for honesty and their network of communities provided the perfect infrastructure for new beliefs to take root, grow, and eventually flourish, forever changing the spiritual landscape of entire continents. This was a form of conquest, yes, but one achieved through persuasion and example, making it all the more permanent and deeply woven into the fabric of society. Yet for all the focus on the great merchant houses and their male patriarchs, history has quietly overlooked a powerful force operating at the very heart of these commercial empires. While the official records might list a man as the head of a trading firm, it was often his wife, mother, or sister who served as the unseen chief financial officer, the master of logistics, and the keeper of the family's most valuable asset, its reputation. In an age without formal banking, the management of complex household finances was a monumental task. A merchant's wife would be responsible for overseeing accounts receivable and payable, managing currency exchange across different denominations, and ensuring that enough liquid capital was on hand to cover sudden expenses or investments. Her keen eye for detail and innate understanding of cash flow often meant the difference between a family business thriving or collapsing into bankruptcy. She was the steady hand on the ledger, providing the financial stability that allowed her husband to take the daring risks that built their fortune, her contributions essential yet systematically erased from the official story. This financial acumen frequently translated into direct commercial power, particularly when a woman found herself widowed. The death of a merchant husband could have been a catastrophic event, plunging a family into poverty. Instead, across Europe and Asia, countless widows seized the opportunity to step out from behind the ledger and into the marketplace themselves. Laws in many regions, such as those in parts of medieval Germany and England, granted a widow the right to continue operating her late husband's business, often under the legal designation of a femme sole. This status allowed her to sue and be sued in court, to own property in her own name, and to enter into contracts independently. We have records of women like these in London and Amsterdam taking over shipping ventures, running sprawling textile operations, and even continuing their husband's role as moneylenders to the gentry. They were not merely keeping the seat warm for a male heir, they were savvy businesswomen in their own right, expanding networks and navigating the volatile world of commerce with a skill honed through years of observation and behind-the-scenes management. Beyond the formal structures of European trade, in other parts of the world, women were not the exception in commerce but the absolute rule. The vibrant markets of West Africa were, and in many places still are, overwhelmingly dominated by women. The formidable Nana Bents of Togo became legendary in the 20th century for their control of the elaborate fabric trade, but their legacy stretches back centuries to a tradition of female economic power. These women operated vast networks that moved gold, cola nuts, and later European manufactures across the Sahara and along the coast. Their authority was rooted in sophisticated kinship systems and matrilineal inheritance, which provided them with capital, trusted agents who were often family members, and a powerful collective identity. They understood that trust was the currency of long-distance trade, and they built it through relational ties that often proved more resilient than the written contracts of their European counterparts. A similar story unfolds across Southeast Asia. In the port cities of the Malay archipelago, women were the central pillars of the local economy. They managed the vital rice trade, operated bustling retail stalls, and most importantly, controlled the intricate money-changing systems that were the lifeblood of any international port. A European, Arab, or Chinese merchant arriving in Malacca or Aceh would first have to negotiate with a female money changer to convert his foreign coin into local currency. This gave these women an unparalleled view of market flows and economic trends, positioning them as indispensable intermediaries and information brokers. Their economic independence was reflected in social customs that astonished early European visitors, such as marital arrangements where the husband moved into the wife's family home and her property remained entirely under her control. In these societies, the ability to generate wealth was not seen as a masculine trait but as a universal skill, and women exercised it with undeniable authority. The influence of these matriarchs extended far beyond the balance sheet into the very social fabric that held merchant networks together. While men might be away on voyages for years at a time, it was the women who remained at home, maintaining the critical web of social and familial connections. They arranged marriages not just for love, but for strategic advantage, weaving together competing trading houses into powerful alliances. They hosted dinners and social gatherings where information was the most valuable commodity exchanged, discreetly sharing news of shipwrecks, political unrest, or market gluts that could make or ruin a fortune. Through their extensive letter writing, they kept far-flung family members informed and invested in each other's success, creating a sense of shared identity across continents. This informal communication network was a vital intelligence system, often more reliable and faster than official channels, and it was almost entirely administered by women whose names never appeared on a corporate charter or a ship's manifest. Recognizing the role of these women does more than just correct a historical oversight. It fundamentally changes our understanding of how merchant power actually functioned. The great male-headed trading dynasties were not monolithic entities but complex partnerships, where gender roles were strategically deployed to maximize advantage. A husband could operate in the very public, high-risk world of international negotiation, while his wife managed the equally critical, private world of finance and reputation management. This division of labor was a brilliant strategy, allowing a family to engage in daring ventures while maintaining a bedrock of stability at home. It reveals that the merchant class's greatest strength was its adaptability and its ability to utilize all available talent, even if that talent operated in the shadows. The story of these overlooked matriarchs is a testament to the quiet, resilient power that has always moved the world, not through dramatic conquest, but through the meticulous, day-by-day management of money, information, and human connection. This relentless pursuit of profit naturally put merchants on a collision course with one of history's other great constants, the tax collector. For rulers, merchants represented a tantalizing and seemingly endless source of revenue, a flowing river of wealth that could fund armies, build monuments, and fill royal coffers. But the merchant class, with their intimate understanding of value, mobility, and loopholes, proved to be an exceptionally slippery target. Their entire profession was built on the art of moving things, goods, money, information, and they applied this same ingenuity to moving their assets just beyond the grasp of the state. This created a centuries-long game of cat and mouse, where the financial survival of empires often hinged on their ability to outsmart the very individuals who fueled their economies. The merchant's playbook for tax avoidance was as creative as it was effective, and many of their strategies feel eerily familiar today. Long before the term offshore account was coined, merchants were masters of moving their wealth to jurisdictions with friendlier policies. A Venetian trader might keep his liquid capital deposited with a banking house in Geneva, far from the prying eyes and heavy hands of the Doge's tax assessors. The ancient practice of barter saw a major resurgence as a tool for evasion. By trading shipments of Egyptian grain for Spanish olive oil without any money changing hands, merchants could conduct enormous deals that left no paper trail for revenue agents to follow. But their most powerful tool was arguably lobbying. Merchant guilds, with their immense collective wealth, became formidable pressure groups. they would negotiate directly with kings, offering a large, upfront loan or a generous gift to the crown in exchange for a sweeping exemption from future tariffs or a significant reduction in export duties. This wasn't just a bribe, it was a sophisticated investment, a calculated purchase of future tax savings that often paid for itself many times over. This ability to simply pick up and move gave merchants a decisive advantage in their negotiations with static, land-based powers. A ruler who imposed crippling taxes would quickly find that the trade which once flourished in his ports had mysteriously migrated to a rival city down the coast. The history of the Mediterranean is filled with examples of thriving commercial centers that were killed by greedy tax policies, their merchant communities voting with their feet and their ships. This mobility forced a fundamental constraint on governments. They had to balance their desire for revenue with the need to remain an attractive, competitive hub for commerce. A king couldn't simply tax at will. He had to constantly look over his shoulder at what his rivals were offering, lest he wake up one morning to find his harbors empty and his treasury bare. The merchant's threat of exit was a silent but potent form of political power, a constant check on the fiscal ambitions of the state. Inevitably, this tension frequently boiled over into direct conflict. In the Roman Empire, the equestrian order, the wealthy class of merchants and businessmen constantly chafed against the tax farming system and the arbitrary exactions of provincial governors. Their resistance and widespread tax evasion are cited by many historians as a critical factor in the long-term fiscal decay of the Western Empire, starving the state of the resources it needed to maintain its legions and infrastructure. Centuries later, in Ming China, the state's insistence on collecting taxes in kind, demanding specific amounts of grain or cloth, proved disastrous. Merchant intermediaries who controlled the transportation and storage of these goods exploited the system relentlessly, creating artificial shortages and driving up prices. The widespread resistance and corruption this inspired contributed to massive peasant revolts and ultimately helped fuel the dynasty's collapse. In both cases, the failure to effectively harness and tax commercial wealth wasn't just an economic misstep, it was an existential crisis that helped topple empires. The most profound impact merchants had on fiscal policy, however, was not in their evasion but in their influence. As states modernized, they began to realize that the old models of plunder and land taxes were inadequate for funding the ambitious wars and projects of the modern age. They increasingly turned to the merchant class not just for loans but for expertise. Who better to design an efficient tax system than the people who understood money, value, and logistics better than anyone? Merchant advisors were brought into royal courts to help design and implement excise taxes on consumption, import and export duties, and other levies on trade itself. This was a monumental shift. It meant that the very architecture of state finance was being designed by the class that would be most affected by it, leading to systems that were often rational and efficient, but also frequently included built-in advantages and loopholes for commercial interests. The state slowly began to professionalize its revenue collection, creating customs houses and bureaucracies that were modeled on the efficient, ledger-based administration of the great merchant houses. In this way, the merchant class didn't just avoid taxes, they ultimately helped write the tax code, shaping the fiscal foundations of the modern world in ways that still echo in our complex systems of global commerce and regulation. For centuries, the world's most powerful merchants operated like sovereign entities, weaving global networks that often bypassed royal authority entirely. But this age of unprecedented commercial independence could not last forever. As European empires emerged from the chaos of the Renaissance and religious wars, they began to consolidate their power, building centralized, modern states with vast administrative bureaucracies and permanent standing armies. These new leviathans looked upon the sprawling, stateless commercial empires of the merchant class and saw not partners but rivals. The immense wealth generated by private trade was a resource too tempting to ignore, and the autonomy of these merchants was a direct challenge to the Crown's authority. A great shift began, a slow but determined campaign by states to reel in the merchant class, to harness their economic power for national goals, and to domesticate these once untamable forces of commerce. The age of the freewheeling merchant prince was coming to an end, replaced by an era where the flag would always follow trade, and the state would always demand its share. This transformation was driven by a powerful new economic doctrine known as mercantilism. Unlike the later ideas of Adam Smith, which viewed wealth as something created through production and exchange, mercantilists saw the world's riches as a finite pie. To them, a nation's power was measured directly by the amount of gold and silver it accumulated in its treasury. The role of commerce, therefore, was not to create wealth but to win it from other nations through a favorable balance of trade, exporting more than you imported, and ensuring the difference was paid in hard bullion. This philosophy turned economics into a form of warfare by other means. Suddenly, the independent merchant, who might happily trade with an enemy nation if the price was right, was seen as a traitor to the national interest. His profit was no longer a private matter, it was a component of state power, and the Crown was determined to control it. Governments enacted a series of ruthless policies designed to bend commerce to the will of the state. The most famous of these were the Navigation Acts, first passed by England in the mid-17th century. These laws were a masterstroke of economic coercion. They decreed that goods could only be imported into England or its colonies on ships that were built, owned, and primarily crewed by English subjects. Furthermore, key enumerated commodities like tobacco, sugar, and cotton produced in the colonies could only be exported to England itself. The goal was to cripple the Dutch merchant marine, which had dominated global shipping, and to force colonial wealth through English ports where it could be taxed and controlled. Overnight, successful merchants who had built businesses on free trade found themselves branded as smugglers and criminals. The state was no longer just a partner or a borrower. It was now the architect of the entire commercial system, dictating who could trade, what they could trade, and where they could sail. The assault on merchant autonomy didn't stop with trade laws. The most powerful tool of merchant power, the great joint stock companies like the East India Company, became a primary target for nationalization. These companies had become too powerful, operating as states within states with their own armies and foreign policies that sometimes conflicted with the Crown's interests. One by one, their royal charters were revoked or radically rewritten. The most dramatic example was the British government's gradual takeover of the East India Company following its mismanagement of the Bengal famine and its financial troubles. Through a series of acts, most notably the Regulating Act of 1773 and the India Act of 1784, the British state stripped the company of its political authority, placing its territorial possessions under the control of a government-appointed board. The merchants who had conquered a subcontinent were now reduced to mere employees of the state, their commercial empire absorbed into the British Crown. The flag had not just followed trade, it had now captured its command center. Faced with this overwhelming state pressure, the merchant class fractured. Many chose the path of assimilation, trading their independence for influence within the new system. The most successful financiers, like the Rothschilds, evolved from free agents into the primary bankers to governments, lending to states for wars and infrastructure in exchange for bonds and guaranteed interest payments. They exchanged the risks of the open sea for the security of a government contract, becoming intertwined with the very power that had sought to tame them. Other merchants simply gave up the fight, selling their businesses or accepting regulated monopolies that offered less profit but more protection from competition. Their innovative, risk-taking spirit was slowly suffocated by bureaucracy and regulation. The wild, unpredictable energy of the free market was being channeled into the controlled canals of state-directed capitalism. And while this new system built railroads and funded industries, it also marked the end of an era where a single merchant with a ship and a dream could truly change the world. The ghost of the medieval merchant banker haunts the gleaming glass towers of our modern financial districts. While the goods have changed from bolts of silk to complex derivatives, and the caravans have been replaced by fiber optic cables, the core strategies of the invisible class are more dominant than ever. Today's multinational corporations are the direct descendants of the great trading companies, wielding a form of stateless power that would make a Hanseatic merchant feel right at home. They have perfected the art of operating across borders, leveraging jurisdictional differences to their advantage in a global game of regulatory arbitrage. A tech giant can design its products in California, manufacture them in Asia, hold its intellectual property in Ireland, and book its profits in a Caribbean haven, all while negotiating tax breaks and subsidies from governments competing for its favor. This is not a new phenomenon. It is the modern expression of a very old merchant principle. Capital is mobile, and it will always flow to where it is treated best. Consider the intricate dance of offshore finance. The use of places like the Cayman Islands or Luxembourg as conduits for capital is a direct echo of the medieval merchant seeking a favorable loan from a banking family in one city-state to avoid the taxes of another. The modern shell company, with its obscured ownership, is the legal equivalent of the discreet handshake deal made in a Venetian coffee house, designed to protect assets and maintain privacy. This system allows vast sums of wealth to exist almost entirely outside the view of any single national government, creating a parallel financial universe where the rules are written by and for a global elite. The motivation remains unchanged from 500 years ago: to preserve and grow wealth by minimizing the claims of the state, a practice pioneered by merchants who were the original masters of moving value just beyond the reach of the tax collector. The sheer scale of corporate lobbying in modern democracies is another powerful legacy. The merchant guilds of old did not simply accept royal decrees. They negotiated them, using their financial leverage to secure favorable treaties and monopolies. Today, this happens in the committee rooms of legislatures and the offices of regulatory agencies. Large corporations spend billions on lobbying efforts, not to propose entirely new laws, but to shape the fine print of legislation in ways that create moats around their businesses, stifle smaller competitors, and protect their profit margins. This is a sophisticated form of the same old game, using economic power to bend the rules of the game itself, ensuring that the playing field is tilted in their favor. It's a testament to the enduring truth that influencing the maker of the laws is often a far more effective strategy than simply obeying them. Perhaps the most profound echo is in the realm of supply chain logistics. The modern corporation's ability to manage a globally dispersed network of suppliers, manufacturers, and distributors is a technological marvel, but its strategic purpose is ancient. It is the digital reincarnation of the merchant's relay trade, designed to optimize efficiency and mitigate risk across vast distances. Companies like Amazon and Apple do not own most of the factories that make their products. They orchestrate them, much like a Medici agent coordinated a network of independent weavers and dyers. This model allows for incredible flexibility and cost control, but it also creates a diffusion of responsibility. When a disaster occurs in a distant factory, the corporation at the top of the chain can distance itself, arguing that it is merely a customer of that supplier, not its master. This legal and ethical buffer is the modern equivalent of the merchant who profited from the spice trade while remaining comfortably removed from the violence used to control it. This deep historical lineage helps us understand contemporary tensions that might otherwise seem baffling. The growing public anger over wealth inequality is not just about the numbers on a spreadsheet. It is a reaction to the sense that a powerful, transnational class operates by a different set of rules. The frustration with corporate power is a modern version of the resentment felt by those who watched the Fugger family bankroll emperors. The endless debate over free markets versus regulation is the latest chapter in a centuries-old struggle between the dynamism of merchant capital and the desire of societies to harness that energy for the common good. Recognizing that these are not entirely new problems, but rather ancient patterns playing out on a global digital stage, is the first step toward crafting solutions that are as sophisticated and enduring as the strategies of the invisible class itself. Their story did not end with the decline of the great trading companies. It simply entered a new phase, proving that the most powerful forces in history are often the ones that adapt, evolve, and learn to thrive in every new age. If you wanted to send a message from London to Paris in the early 1800s, you were at the mercy of the weather, a horse's stamina, and the state of the roads. For most of Europe, news traveled at a walking pace, but for one family, news traveled at a speed that seemed almost supernatural. The Rothschilds did not just participate in the financial markets of 19th century Europe. They mastered time and space itself, creating an information network so superior it became their most potent and secret weapon. While governments relied on sluggish diplomatic couriers, the Rothschilds used their own private fleet of fast ships and couriers, a shadow postal service dedicated solely to their business. They developed complex codes to encrypt their messages, not just to protect against interception, but to shroud their operations in a veil of mystery that amplified their perceived omniscience. A Rothschild agent in Paris, learning of a battlefield outcome hours or even days before anyone else, could dispatch a coded message that would allow the family to make decisive moves on the London Stock Exchange before the official news had even crossed the channel. This wasn't just insider trading. It was the creation of a private intelligence agency whose sole purpose was to convert information into capital, giving the family a godlike view of European affairs that allowed them to consistently be one step ahead of every other player on the board. The true genius of their operation, however, lay in its structure. The Rothschild Empire was a family firm in the most literal sense, and this was the source of its unparalleled cohesion and trust. Mayor Amschel Rothschild, the patriarch, strategically placed his 5 sons in the 5 major financial capitals of Europe: Amschel in Frankfurt, Nathan in London, James in Paris, Salomon in Vienna, and Karl in Naples. This was not merely a business expansion, it was the deployment of a single, distributed organism. Each brother was his own master, yet they operated with a unity of purpose that no loose coalition of partners could ever hope to match. They trusted each other implicitly, a luxury unavailable to their competitors who had to rely on contracts and lawyers. This allowed them to execute complex, cross-border financial maneuvers with a speed and confidentiality that stunned their rivals. A loan for the Austrian government could be negotiated by Salomon in Vienna, funded by Nathan's profits in London, and managed by James in Paris, all within the closed loop of the family. Disputes were settled internally, strategies were kept secret, and profits remained within the family trust. They were, in effect, the first truly multinational corporation, and their corporate culture was blood. This formidable network found its ultimate expression in the fiery crucible of the Napoleonic Wars. While the conflict ravaged continents and toppled thrones, the Rothschilds saw not just tragedy, but a landscape of opportunity. Their most famous and often misunderstood coup was financing the British war effort against Napoleon. Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London undertook the Herculean task of funneling vast sums of gold to the Duke of Wellington's armies across Europe, navigating blockades and currency fluctuations. He accomplished this not by moving physical gold, which was vulnerable to privateers, but through a brilliant web of bills of exchange and arbitrage, essentially moving money through ledgers rather than ships. The legendary story that he made a fortune by learning of the victory at Waterloo first, and then buying up depressed British government bonds, is likely apocryphal, but it persists because it captures an essential truth. The Rothschilds were so deeply enmeshed in war finance that their fortunes and the fates of nations were inextricably linked. They profited not from the war's destruction, but from the immense logistical challenge of funding it, becoming the indispensable quartermasters to the powers that would shape post-Napoleonic Europe. Their influence, however, extended far beyond the battlefield and into the very heart of peacemaking and governance. In the aftermath of Waterloo, the victorious powers gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of Europe. While Prince Metternich and Lord Castlereagh are remembered as the diplomats of the age, the Rothschilds were the unseen architects of the financial settlement that made any political peace possible. They provided the capital that allowed fragile restored monarchies to function, managed the transfer of war indemnities, and helped stabilize currencies. By loaning money to virtually every government involved, they positioned themselves as the permanent bankers to the establishment, their financial health now a matter of national security for the entire continent. A king might be overthrown by revolution, but the debt to the Rothschilds would simply be inherited by the next government. This gave the family a unique, enduring form of power that was immune to the political upheavals that routinely swept away their aristocratic clients. They had become the constant, the stable center around which the volatile world of 19th-century politics orbited, proving that in the modern age, the power to grant or withhold credit could be more decisive than the power to declare war. Yet for all their staggering achievement, the voyages of the treasure fleet were not the product of a singular imperial vision, but rather the culmination of a powerful and often hidden partnership between the Ming throne and the merchant class. While the Yongle emperor sought to project Chinese majesty and secure legitimacy for his usurper reign, the merchants of the coastal provinces saw in these grand armadas something far more practical, the greatest business opportunity in history. These expeditions were phenomenally expensive, requiring the construction of hundreds of the largest wooden ships ever built, the provisioning of thousands of sailors and soldiers, and the stockpiling of vast quantities of luxury goods for presentation and trade. The imperial treasury alone could not bear this cost. A significant portion of the funding was quietly supplied by merchant syndicates from Fujian and Guangdong, who viewed their investment not as a tax, but as a down payment on access to the untapped markets of the Indian Ocean. They provided more than just silver. They contributed the essential human capital navigators who understood the monsoon patterns, linguists who could negotiate in foreign ports, and seasoned traders who knew what commodities would fetch the highest prices in Calicut or Hormuz. The treasure fleet, in its essence, was a public-private partnership on an epic scale, where imperial ambition was leveraged to serve commercial ends. The goals of these two partners, while aligned on the surface, were fundamentally different. The emperor's court spoke the language of the tribute system, a Confucian framework where foreign rulers would acknowledge Chinese superiority by offering symbolic gifts and performing the kowtow. In return, they would receive even more lavish Chinese goods and the emperor's benevolent recognition. This was a political and ideological transaction designed to create an orderly, China-centric world order. For the merchants sailing with the fleet, however, this ritual was merely a convenient diplomatic theater that opened the door to the real business. Behind the ceremony of presenting silks and porcelains to a local sultan lay a frenzy of private trade. Crew members were permitted to conduct their own commerce, and the holds of the accompanying ships were filled not just with imperial gifts, but with merchandise intended for open market exchange. The official records might note the granting of imperial brocade to the King of Ceylon, but they remained silent on the subsequent deals struck for sacks of pepper, gems, and exotic woods that would be sold for immense personal profit back in China. The fleet was a floating mercantile city, using its diplomatic immunity to establish trade relations under the protective umbrella of Ming military power. This incredible fusion of state power and commercial interest allowed the treasure fleet to achieve what no purely private venture could. It temporarily rewrote the rules of Indian Ocean commerce. For a few brief decades, Chinese goods, particularly its exquisite blue and white porcelain and refined silks, flowed directly into markets that had previously received them only through long, costly chains of Arab and Indian middlemen. The presence of such a powerful navy also suppressed piracy along key routes, making travel safer for all merchants and fostering an unprecedented period of maritime stability. The voyages created a network of loyal trading partners from Java to Malacca to the Swahili coast, all now personally familiar with the quality of Chinese products and the might that stood behind them. This was the merchant's dream realized: a secure, state-enforced trade corridor stretching across half the world, dramatically cutting costs and increasing profit margins. The expeditions effectively announced China's arrival as the dominant naval and commercial power on Earth, a position built as much on the promise of lucrative trade as on the spectacle of its floating armies. Yet the very source of the fleet's success, its immense cost and its empowerment of the commercial class, ultimately sowed the seeds of its own destruction. Following the death of the Yongle Emperor, a new faction gained influence at the imperial court in Beijing. These were the conservative Confucian scholars, men who deeply distrusted the merchant class and the coastal provinces from which they hailed. Their worldview was agrarian and inward-looking. They believed true wealth sprang from the land and that the empire's priorities should be defending the northern frontier against nomadic steppe tribes, not wasting resources on extravagant oceanic voyages. They saw the merchants not as partners, but as corrupting parasites who were enriching themselves and their southern power base at the expense of the state treasury and traditional values. The fleets, in their view, were a dangerous distraction that encouraged a vulgar focus on profit and exposed China to foreign ideas that could undermine its social order. The political struggle that ensued was a classic clash between two visions of power, one commercial, maritime, and outward-looking, and the other bureaucratic, terrestrial, and inward-looking. The Confucian scholars won. They argued persuasively that the voyages were a colossal drain on resources needed for more pressing domestic concerns. They stoked fears about the growing influence and wealth of the merchant community, painting them as a threat to centralized imperial control. One by one, the great voyages were cancelled. The ships were left to rot in their harbors, and the meticulously kept logs and charts of Zheng He's journeys were deliberately destroyed by court officials to erase the very memory of this alternative path and to prevent any future emperor from reviving such ambitions. The greatest navy the world had ever known was scuttled by the stroke of a bureaucrat's brush, a testament to the fact that the most formidable obstacle to merchant power has never been a rival fleet, but the shifting currents of domestic politics. This immense power wielded by the merchant class throughout history forces us to confront an uncomfortable and enduring question. Where is the line between shrewd business and moral bankruptcy? The same innovative spirit that devised the bill of exchange to ease long-distance trade could also design the financial instruments that funded the transatlantic slave trade, calculating the insurance premiums on human cargo with the same cold precision as any other commodity. A merchant's ability to see the world in terms of supply, demand, and profit margins, a strength that built global networks, could also become a profound moral blindness. In the pursuit of a favorable balance sheet, human beings could be reduced to entries in a ledger, their suffering silenced by the language of accounting and the promise of a dividend. This is the central, agonizing contradiction of the invisible class. They were agents of profound connection and terrifying exploitation, often simultaneously. We see this duality play out in countless historical moments. Consider the merchant who corners the market on grain during a famine. By leveraging his superior logistics and market knowledge, he can create an artificial scarcity, driving prices to astronomical levels and reaping a fortune from the desperation of a starving population. Is this simply the free market at work, the natural result of supply and demand? Or is it a fundamental betrayal of a basic social contract, where economic power is wielded without any sense of ethical responsibility? This tension was rarely acknowledged in the merchants' own ledgers, which recorded the soaring profits but were silent on the human cost. Their moral framework was often bounded by the walls of their counting house, where a successful transaction was a good transaction, regardless of the ripple effects it created in the wider world. Nowhere is this moral compromise more stark than in the merchant's role in systems of outright exploitation, particularly slavery and colonialism. These were not anomalies carried out by a few rogue actors. They were vast, complex commercial enterprises engineered for profit. The entire economy of the antebellum American South, with its sprawling cotton plantations, was built on a financial architecture designed by merchants and bankers in London, New York, and New Orleans. They provided the loans to purchase land and enslaved people, ensured the plantations against crop failure, and financed the ships that carried the cotton to mills in England. Their participation was active, essential, and highly profitable. They could tell themselves they were merely providing a service, facilitating commerce as they always had, but in reality, they were the indispensable gears in a machine of mass human suffering, profiting at every turn from its relentless operation. This ability to abstract and distance themselves from the consequences of their business was a key feature of their power. A shareholder in the Dutch East India Company living comfortably in Amsterdam could collect his dividends from the spice trade without ever witnessing the genocide his investment had funded in the Banda Islands. A textile magnate in Manchester could celebrate the efficiency of his new mechanized looms without being forced to confront the brutal conditions of the cotton fields that supplied his raw material. The supply chain itself became a moral buffer, allowing those at the top to benefit from exploitation while remaining far removed from its visceral reality. This disconnect between profit and consequence remains one of the most troubling legacies of the merchant mindset, a challenge we still grapple with in our own era of globalized production and consumption. Yet, to solely condemn the merchant class as amoral profiteers would be to ignore the other side of their legacy. The very same drive for profit also fueled extraordinary acts of human connection and progress. The merchant caravans on the Silk Road did not just carry silk and spices. They carried ideas, religions, and technologies that enriched every culture they touched. The merchants' need for accurate accounting helped develop mathematics. Their need for safe passage spurred advancements in cartography and shipbuilding. Their networks became conduits not only for goods but for knowledge, fostering a level of global awareness and cultural exchange that had never existed before. The question is not whether their influence was purely good or purely evil, but how we reconcile these two inextricably linked facets of their impact. This historical tension leaves us with a critical lesson for our own time. The story of the invisible class demonstrates that economic power, left entirely to its own devices and divorced from a strong ethical framework, will inevitably gravitate towards exploitation. It shows us that innovation and connectivity, while powerful forces for good, are not inherently virtuous. They are tools that can be used to build a more prosperous and interconnected world, or to build more efficient systems of oppression. The merchant's legacy is a permanent reminder that with great power comes great responsibility, a warning that the pursuit of profit must be tempered by a commitment to human dignity. Their history challenges us to build an economy where the invisible hand is guided by a visible and unwavering moral compass, ensuring that the engines of commerce serve humanity and not the other way around. History offers a masterclass in resilience for any modern entrepreneur staring down economic uncertainty or market disruption. Consider the Hanseatic League, that formidable network of medieval merchant guilds. They didn't survive for centuries by relying on a single trade route or a solitary powerful patron. Instead, they built a decentralized web of interconnected cities, a system so robust that if one port was blockaded or fell into political turmoil, trade could simply reroute through another. Their power was in the network itself, not any individual node. This is a powerful lesson for today's business leaders who might be tempted to put all their eggs in one basket, whether that's a single supplier, a dominant platform, or one key client. The merchants of old knew that true security comes from options, from building a wide and diverse ecosystem of partners, collaborators, and channels. It's about creating a business that is anti-fragile, that can not only withstand shocks but can actually find new opportunities within them, just as those medieval traders found new paths when old ones were closed. This historical wisdom extends far beyond logistics into the very heart of modern leadership, the critical importance of cultural intelligence. The most successful merchants, like those on the Indian Ocean trade routes, were not just moving goods, they were master negotiators who understood that a deal in Calicut was fundamentally different from a deal in Canton. They invested time in learning local customs, languages, and business etiquette because they knew trust was the ultimate currency. They built relationships, not just transactions. In our hyper-connected global economy, this skill is more valuable than ever. An entrepreneur today might be negotiating a contract with a team in Berlin one hour and a factory manager in Vietnam the next. The ability to navigate these cultural nuances, to understand indirect communication styles, to respect hierarchical structures, and to build genuine rapport across a digital divide is what separates a good global business from a great one. It's the modern equivalent of knowing the monsoon schedules. It's the hidden knowledge that allows you to sail smoothly when others are lost at sea. Yet, even with the best network and the highest cultural IQ, every business operates within a framework of rules, and here history offers perhaps its most potent lesson in strategic foresight. The great merchant banking families of Renaissance Italy, like the Medicis, were absolute masters of navigating regulatory environments. They didn't just react to new laws, they anticipated them. They positioned themselves as indispensable advisors to popes and princes, effectively helping to write the financial regulations they would then operate under. They understood that the rules of the game are not set in stone. They are a conversation, and it is far better to be a participant in that conversation than a mere subject of its outcome. For a modern startup founder or CEO, This translates to proactive engagement. It means building relationships with policymakers before a crisis hits, understanding the intent behind regulations, and even helping to shape sensible policies that foster innovation while protecting the public good. It's about seeing regulation not as a barrier to be hacked, but as a landscape to be navigated with sophistication and a long-term view. However, the most sobering lesson from the past is a stark warning about the perils of unchecked ambition. The history of commerce is littered with colossal failures not because of a lack of innovation or acumen, but because of a catastrophic moral blind spot. The British and American merchants who engineered the opium trade with China in the 19th century were undoubtedly brilliant logisticians and savvy negotiators. They built immense fortunes by creating demand and exploiting a market, but in their relentless pursuit of profit, they completely divorced their actions from their societal consequences, triggering addiction, social collapse, and war. Their legacy is one of infamy, not admiration. This is the ultimate cautionary tale for the modern age. A business model that relies on addiction, whether to a substance, a platform, or a behavior, may be lucrative in the short term, but it builds a foundation of sand. History teaches us that profit pursued without a parallel commitment to ethical impact inevitably leads to a devastating backlash, whether from consumers, regulators, or history itself. Sustainable influence isn't just about market share. It's about the permission you have from society to operate. Ultimately, the journey through the rise and fall of these invisible architects reveals that the most enduring legacy is written in more than just ledgers. The merchants who are remembered favorably are those who understood that their enterprise was part of a larger social fabric. The Medici family, for all their political cunning, are celebrated for their patronage of the arts that fueled the Renaissance. Their wealth built something that outlasted their bank. In contrast, the directors of the Dutch East India Company, who pursued quarterly dividends with ruthless efficiency, are remembered for genocide and corruption, their corporate empire crumbling under the weight of its own ethical vacuum. The lesson for today's entrepreneur is clear. Building a truly great company is about more than an exit strategy or a skyrocketing valuation. It's about building an institution that creates value not just for shareholders, but for employees, communities, and the world at large. It is about understanding that the greatest business strategy of all is to leave the world better than you found it, ensuring that your influence, though it may operate out of sight, is felt for generations as a force for genuine progress. As we bring this exploration to a close, it's worth reflecting on the profound irony that defines the legacy of these hidden architects of history. The very invisibility they cultivated as a strategy has become their most enduring feature in our historical memory, their stories often overshadowed by the dramatic tales of kings and conquerors they so often bankrolled. Yet, as we've seen, from the spice routes of antiquity to the digital marketplaces of today, the quiet calculations made in merchant counting houses have consistently redirected the flow of human events with a force rivaling any army. Their networks built the infrastructure of globalization centuries before the term was coined, creating the connective tissue between civilizations through the simple, powerful language of supply and demand. What began as local trade in Mesopotamian grain evolved into financial instruments sophisticated enough to fund empires and trigger conflicts that reshaped continents, proving that economic ambition has always been a primary engine of historical change, operating just beneath the surface of official records and royal proclamations. This journey through the shadows of history reveals a crucial lesson about power itself. While thrones and dynasties rise and fall with dramatic visibility, the influence of capital and commerce demonstrates a remarkable persistence, adapting to new eras with fluid grace. The medieval merchant guilds that once negotiated with kings have their direct descendants in today's multinational corporations that lobby governments. The complex credit systems of Renaissance bankers echo in our modern global financial markets. The supply chains managed by Hanseatic merchants look remarkably similar in structure, if not in technology, to the logistics networks that deliver goods to our doors today. This continuity suggests that understanding these patterns, how economic power consolidates, operates, and influences political structures, is not just an academic exercise but a crucial lens for interpreting our present moment. The challenges we face with corporate influence, wealth inequality, and the tension between national interests and global commerce are not entirely new problems, but rather the latest manifestations of an ancient dynamic playing out on a digital stage. Perhaps the most valuable takeaway from these stories is the importance of looking beyond the obvious narratives to understand how our world truly operates. History is so often presented as a sequence of great men and dramatic events, but as we've discovered, the quiet accumulation of merchant influence in the background has frequently determined which great men could pursue their ambitions and which dramatic events would even occur. This perspective empowers us to become more discerning observers of our own time, to question not just who holds official power, but whose economic interests are being served by particular policies and decisions. It encourages us to look for the modern equivalents of these invisible networks, the algorithmic systems that shape our choices, the supply chains that determine what we consume, and the financial flows that influence our politics. By recognizing these patterns, we gain a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the forces that continue to shape our collective destiny, often operating just beyond our immediate view. We genuinely hope this journey through the hidden corridors of economic history has offered you a new perspective on the past and present. If these stories of the invisible architects of empire resonated with you, we'd be incredibly grateful if you'd share this video with others who might find it fascinating. Don't forget to subscribe for more content that explores the overlooked forces that have shaped our world. We're truly curious to hear which of these merchant stories you found most compelling. Was it the banking dynasties that funded wars, the spice traders who redrew the map of the world, or the unsung women who managed the networks behind the scenes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of history's hidden forces, and remember, the most powerful currents shaping our world have always flowed not just through palaces and battlefields, but through the quiet, determined efforts of those who understood that commerce, in its many forms, truly moves the world.